Hey tea heads, this is Don from Mayleaf. In this video, how can you save a stale tea? I could have also named this video how to re-roast an oolong tea, because this technique is often used for oolongs that are in storage and are aging. But as I hope we'll find out in this video, you can use this method for other types of tea as well. So what we're talking about today is a refresher roast. And I want to distinguish the difference between this and other types of roasting. So you have different purposes for roasting tea. The roasting, which is often done at origin, for oolong teas especially, is designed to do a couple of things. The first is to add flavor, change the flavor, so bring about Maillard and caramelization reactions in the tea leaf so that you're adding, deepening and changing the flavor and aroma of the tea. And it also has the purpose of fixing the aromas of the tea so that the tea will last longer. So it basically sort of deepens and fixes the flavor and the aromas of the tea. But that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is a refresher roast. Roast which is done very lightly in order to dispel any sort of stale taste in the tea leaf. Oftentimes that stale taste comes from excessive moisture entering the leaf because it's being stored over a long period of time and some of the environmental humidity has been allowed to affect it. So obviously this is more of a factor when you are storing teas in more humid countries. But I found even in London, which is relatively dry, I mean our humidity is sort of, we measure our humidity on our shelves, it's usually between sort of 50 to 58% relative humidity. You will notice, or we will notice, that after a tea has been stored for 5-6 years, that I can start to taste that staleness depending upon the tea type, of course. And we'll talk about which tea types this applies to mostly in a little bit. But what is that stale taste? How do you know that you have got a tea which is a prime candidate for this refresher roast technique? Well, obviously that's a matter of taste. It's something for you to decide upon. I hope that you've tasted the tea previously, and so you will note the difference that the storage has made on your tea. But usually what you're sort of looking for is a few things. So first of all, you may be noticing a sort of cardboardy, dusty, it's a little bit sweet, but like sort of, you know how brown paper bags can have a sort of sweet but papery note to it. That's one thing. You may notice some sourness. If it's very humid, it starts to develop some sour notes in the tea. You may notice that the texture of the tea after you drink it is just non-transformative. It's dry, but it's not transforming. So you get that initial dryness, but it doesn't change to anything else. You may also notice that you get simply a reduction in the level of taste or the level of aromatics, or you get less infusions out of the tea. So if you notice that the tea just doesn't have the same vibrancy and has these additional sort of undesirable notes in the tea, then you may have a tea which is a good candidate for this refresher roast. I have to say that this is a relatively controversial technique. I've spoken to producers in Taiwan, and this is a technique often used for Taiwanese oolongs, who say that if you have to re-roast your tea, then clearly you're storing it wrong, and it basically you should be looking at your storage better. Which I guess is true, but sometimes we can't control everything in our storage. Other people say, hey, that sour, stale taste is actually just the progress of, you know, the tea, and it's going to be moving into an aged state, so it might be better to leave it. You know, I get different opinions on this. The point here is this: if you taste your tea and you're not enjoying it, then why not do something about it? Try to change it, at least for a small quantity. And what I'm going to be recommending here throughout this video is that you focus on small batches rather than taking all of your precious tea and affecting it with a roast that may not be beneficial to it. So just using small batches and changing the taste so that you can enjoy your tea right now. I should also say that this technique is not going to save tea that was not good at the beginning. So, you know, obviously the original leaf, the original quality of the tea is what's paramount, and you're not going to save a tea which was originally bad and turn it into a great tea or even a good tea by using this technique at all. This is about taking tea which you liked or loved and you've noticed that it's changed and that change isn't something that's particularly desirable, and you want to see if you can bring it back to its former glory, at least for this session. Right, so what is this refresher roast? What are the parameters? This technique has been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years. In fact, I think in the Chalu book, in the Song Dynasty, they talked about, you always talk about like breaking off a piece of the tea cake and then just sort of roasting it, just to activate the tea, they called it, or you know, bring about a more desirable flavor. Presumably that was to ward off, to drive off excessive humidity in the leaf and drive away or dispel this stale taste in the tea. So you've got various different parameters, just like everything in tea, that you can play with when you're doing this refresher roast. The first is how often you roast your tea. And as I said, I personally like the approach of I taste a tea that's in storage, I don't particularly like it, I think that there's a stale note, then I'll take a small amount, I'll roast it. That will be my refreshed roast for maybe a few sessions, and I'll usually leave the rest of the tea sitting. Now, if I note that it's very, very off and I think that it's really been affected by humidity, then I'll do a test roast with a small batch again of the tea, try to dial in my parameters until I make the commitment to do a refresher roast on all of the tea that I may have, because I don't want to obviously ruin it. And I have to say, you've got to be careful with this refresher roast, because you can really make a great tea worse by doing it incorrectly. Next is what temperature you should be refresh roasting your tea. I would say that you need to keep the temperature low. You need to keep the temperature below where Maillard reactions are happening. So, because remember, we're not trying to add flavor or change the flavor. We're trying to dispel or clean up any stale flavors that exist in the tea. So I would say it needs to be under 100 degrees or 210 Fahrenheit. I would recommend a range between sort of 55 degrees, 135 Fahrenheit, to 75 degrees, 165 Fahrenheit. That is the temperature range that I think is a safe temperature range. You're not going to scorch the tea. You're not going to add excessive notes to the tea. You are going to be more trying to drive away the humidity and the stale aroma in the tea. The next very important question is how long you should be roasting your tea. And I personally think that this is where you should be experimenting and always err on the side of caution. So always go for shorter times rather than longer times. I have ruined great teas, including ginger and maize. Yes, you can cry for me, because I have overdone it. The temperature has been the right temperature, I think, but I have just pushed the time too long. And what I find happens is, the good news is that the humidity and the stale taste is the first taste to disappear when you're doing this refresher roast. But if you go too long, then you start to reduce the actual intensity of the natural desirable aromatics of the tea, and it starts to become muted. So I would always say err on the side of caution, go with small roasts, small batch roasts to begin with, get your parameter. Time is probably the key one here, and you know, really try to be careful that you don't overcommit with too long a roast on too much tea. I think that the key factor here in terms of determining your starting point is the quantity of tea that you're going to be roasting, and also the shape of the tea leaf. So I've got strip oolong here in front of me, and I've got some imperial green here. Again, strip, so it's you know, very high surface area exposed to the heat, and therefore I would say that your times should be kept low. I would even suggest 15 minutes to half an hour as your initial test roast, and I literally take enough for a small guy one, and I do that test, check it out, see how see if all of that sort of stale aroma has dissipated. If it hasn't, then I'll go a bit further, but you don't want to cross that point where you're starting to reduce or mute the flavor of the actual tea itself. So if it's strip, I would say start at sort of 15 minutes to half an hour. If it's a ball rolled oolong, then you usually need longer. I would sort of start at sort of an hour and a half and then, you know, extend from there. But it really depends on the tea. You really need to dial it in. And obviously if you have more tea, then you're probably going to be extending that time a bit longer as well. Okay, next is what you should do after you roast it. Should you leave it to rest? Because traditionally, if you're doing the hotter roast, so not the refresher roast, but the roast which is often done at origin, where you are trying to encourage Maillard reactions and caramelization and deepening and fixing the flavor of the tea, then you would always, well, you should rest the tea for weeks, if not months, usually in breathable containers, to allow that roast to settle, to allow it the leaves to really adapt to the roast. But because this roast is a refresher roast, it's a very light roast at low temperature, I personally don't think you really need to wait at all. You just need to let it cool down, let it settle for an hour or two, and you can actually taste the tea, which is the beautiful thing about this. So you can dial in the parameters. You don't have to wait 2 weeks to figure it out and then sort of go, oh, it should have been a bit longer, and then do it again. That's my personal opinion. I know a lot of you out there may disagree with it, but the tests I've done, I don't notice a difference me leaving a refresher roast for just an hour versus, you know, a few days versus a few weeks. I would say whatever you do, when you take the leaves out from whichever method you're roasting it, we're going to talk about that next, then you've got to let them cool down before you put them in storage, right? So that you don't want them warm, because there'll be this sort of humid environment that will start to be created if you put the tea leaves in a tin or something, or a jar, whilst they're still warm. So definitely leave them for about an hour, let them cool down completely before you store them away. You can, and I do this for some of my teas, go grab yourself, it's super cheap, little packs of silica gel. This absorbs water. Stick them into your storage container, and that will help to prevent any more humidity from entering the leaf, and it will help to protect the storage of your tea. Right, before we move into which method to use, let's quickly talk about which types of tea I would not advise this for. I would not advise refresher roasts on raw pu'er, because raw pu'er needs humidity. It's the humidity which contributes to the post-fermentation, the aging, and so I would not recommend that you use it for raw pu'er. I would also not recommend this technique for ripe pu'er for similar reasons. Although the aging process is different compared with raw and ripe, I still think that ripe pu'er needs that little bit of humidity to keep it aging. And I also think for white teas that you are storing specifically for aging, I do not think that this refresher roast works. If you are trying to maintain the freshness of a white tea, then maybe you want to use this technique, but I wouldn't recommend it, and I certainly don't do it for my white teas. What I use this technique for is oolongs, obviously. That's the classic use case for this refresher roast, but I also use it on black teas, and I also use it on green teas. So let's talk about the methods. There are essentially 3 methods for doing this refresher roast. The first is using an oven, and I'm lucky enough that I have my own dedicated tea roaster that I can set temperatures and times, and it rotates on spinning sieves, and it's perfect because I know that I'm only roasting tea in there, so I'm not going to have any other flavors or aromatics. Oh, I should say, after you have taken the hot leaves out of however you are roasting it, make sure that you do not store it anywhere where there are some other strong odors. That's very, very important. So yes, I have my own tea roasting oven, so that's the ideal. Having your own dedicated tea roasting oven. The roasting oven that I have has extraction, so that essentially there's always humidity being taken out of the oven, so you're not roasting it in a humid environment. And so that's perfect. But you can also use your domestic oven, set it to the temperature that you want, so between 55, 135 to 75, 165, somewhere in that range. Bring it to temperature, and you can put the tea leaves on a baking tray there, and you can leave it as long as the oven doesn't have food smells. Now, obviously that's very difficult if you're using your oven in your kitchen. So you may want to purchase a small oven for this purpose, or make sure that your oven is very, very clean. So that's the first method, oven roasting. And I would say that's the best method. It's the most consistent. You can control the temperature really well. Some people like to use the second method, which is using a slow cooker or a rice cooker. If you do that, very important that you don't put the lid on, because that will keep the humidity in. As I would recommend you put like a clean kitchen towel cloth over the top to absorb humidity. And the slow cookers, sometimes you can change the temperature. They tend to, rice cookers tend to keep the rice at around sort of 55, 60 degrees, so sort of 135 to 145 Fahrenheit. That's okay. I would make sure that I would try to measure the temperature so that I would know what the temperature is. So you can use the sort of slow cooker, rice cooker method. And the third pretty wild way of doing it is by doing it over a pan. And I would only recommend you using the pan method. So literally taking a frying pan, preferably something that's quite thick, like cast iron or like a steel, but the thickness maintains a consistent temperature. So you don't want hot spots in there which would scorch certain leaves. If you're using this method, then I would recommend you only do enough for 1 or 2 sessions, because it's very easy for you to ruin your tea this way. But it's sort of a fun way of doing it, and I like to do it. So for example, if I really want to taste a tea, or I really want to drink a tea, and I taste it and I go, it's got that stale taste, then I might literally take a handful of it and put it in using the pan method and sort of roast it for sort of 10, 15 minutes that way, and then drink my tea. And usually I get really good results with it. So how would you do that? Well, you turn your heat, whatever it is, to the lowest setting possible, and you want to bring that pan to around 60 to 70 degrees, so sort of 155 to 165 Fahrenheit. It would be helpful if you've got a little pointer thermometer, so you can really get an accurate gauge on what the reading is on the pan. Usually, another way that I've sort of figured out a way to sort of guess the temperature so you can practice is put some water in. And when you start to see sort of nice sort of vapor, very visible vapor coming off it, that's usually around 70 degrees Celsius or 165 Fahrenheit. If you start to see it bubbling, that's too hot. So you want to sort of just see this sort of nice vapor. Obviously, if you're going to then roast the tea in the pan, you've got to make sure that that pan is completely dry, but you can at least sort of gauge, how high you should hold it above the flame and how high the flame should be. I would recommend a low flame, and then just sort of keeping the pan sort of about, 10, 15 centimeters above the flame, and then shaking the pan. And if you start to see any little wisps of smoke coming off the leaf, then take that pan away from the heat, that you've gone too hot. So you want to really make sure you basically don't want to see anything happening with the leaves, but just shaking it above the pan. You can experiment with that. It's inevitable that you'll have a little bit of catching, but you will drive away the moisture and this stale taste, and you will get a really, really nice tea. And if you roast your one batch, your one session, it's not going to be the end of the world. You might enjoy the taste itself, and it's a fun way to do it as well. So those are the 3 methods. The oven method is the best. The rice cooker, slow cooker method is pretty good, but you've got to watch out for moisture. And the pan method is a bit crazy, but it does work. And of course, once you've dialed in your parameters, if you choose, you can take the whole batch of your tea and then do the refresher roast on all of it. But I would say, again, be cautious. Only do that if you really are confident that you've dialed in your parameters correctly. Okay, let's get to tasting. I have in front of me here 1960s style Tie Guan Yin. This has been stored for about 6 years, and I noted when I tasted it a couple of weeks ago that it was still a great tea, still lovely, but it started to develop that little bit of sweet cardboardy note to it, and I didn't like it. So I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to test the roast. The roast is this one. I've got a yellow sticker here, and I've got a yellow sticker here so that I can determine which one is the roast, but I'm going to try to blind taste this. So I'm not going to do a full 10-step tasting here. I'm going to go straight in with the leaves. So that's the roasted, and that's the unroasted. Now I want to be blind here, So how do I blind this when it's just me? Well, this is an exercise in sort of being mindless. You can also try to spell supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. No, I've spelled it completely. supercalifra. Well, anyway, you see, I've now completely. I have no idea which one is which. You may have followed along, but I don't know which one is which. So let's now have a smell of these wet leaves, and we can see if I can pick up which one is the re-roasted one, refresher roasted one, and which one has been left in its original state. So the parameters I did on this roast, I roasted it in my oven for 20 minutes at 75 degrees Celsius. That's about 165 or 167 Fahrenheit. So that's the parameter that I used. And that just comes from a little bit of experience playing around. I certainly did not notice a big amount of this sort of stale or humid sourness in the tea, so I didn't want to overdo it. And as I said, because these are strip and relatively sort of thinner leaves, we want to make sure that we don't overdo it and start to dissipate the aromatics. So let's give this a quick rinse. And I've got to be careful that I don't look at the bottom of the Gaiwan to see which one's which. Okay. It's fun, you can do this yourself. It's one of the best ways to do it is to taste blind afterwards, because that way you're going to be honest about whether or not you were successful or not. Okay, let's have a smell. Smells delicious. This is a roasted 1960s style Teaware. I purchased it in 2014, 15, and it's been stored in a tin in my cupboard. And it doesn't, it didn't have a really particularly stale note, but enough that I wanted to re-roast it. I am picking up a slight cardboardy note in that one. Let's smell this one and compare. I'm not picking up that cardboardy note in this one. This smells like the same aromatics. So cherries, almost has a Yencha style quality to it, like cherry storm, cherries, mangosteens, a little bit of wet woods. But this one has something extra, and that extra is not something I particularly like. It has a sort of, a cardboardy note. I think so. I'm starting to smell it in this one, but no, this one seems a bit stronger in that note. Okay, so we're gonna try to brew this equalish amounts of time and see if we get the right answer. Or if not, then I may have done it incorrectly, and then I can work on my parameters to improve it. I've also, as you can see here, done the same with Imperial Green. I roasted it at the same time, so same parameters exactly. This is a 2017 Imperial Green, so 4 years old. And again, well, I haven't tasted it, actually, the 2017, but I'm assuming that I would note a difference between the two. Green teas is a bit unusual to do it for green teas, but in my experience, I found that it works. And again, what we're not trying to do is add any caramelization or change the color or make it darker. We're trying to clean up the tea, in essence. It's like restoring a painting, that's old, just sort of cleaning it up, bringing it back to its sort of original glory. Okay, again, be careful, don't want to see. Right. You can see the color difference. Is there any color difference? No. No color difference. So again, you don't want to see a color difference. That would show you that you have over roasted the tea, or you've brought it to a too hot a temperature and you're getting browning or Maillard reactions. Okay, let's start with this one. It's going to be hot, so should let it cool down. Delicious tea. It really reminds me of a very fruity Yencha Very much like Cherry Storm. I'm getting a lot of cherries, a lot of resinous quality in it, like cedarwood resins and cherries, a little bit of mangosteen. And there is a slight storage note. I wouldn't say it's cardboardy so much, but it's yeah, a little bit dusty in its taste. And the texture, hard to, this is why comparisons are so good, because you can sort of, you can really gauge it by tasting it against another tea, but possibly a little bit more of a catch in my throat than I would expect from this tea. Okay. Cleaner taste. Still got the fruit, still got the cherry, still got the resinous quality. Perhaps a little bit less vaporous in its aromatics. I'm starting to doubt myself. Yeah, I would say that this has a little bit less vaporousness in its aromatics, but tastes cleaner, tastes lighter, tastes brighter, and has a smoother finish to it. A more transformative finish rather than smoother. I'm getting that dryness, but it's moving to a juiciness, which is what I would want. So my reaction to this is I would prefer this tea because of everything that I've just talked about. But if it's the roasted tea, I think I would even take it down a notch. I might do 15 minutes on the tea if it's a roasted tea. But I don't get any of that cardboardy note, and I don't get the staleness, the sort of dusty stale taste. And I do there. Now it's cooled down. Very, very clear difference. I'm relatively confident. I will let you look first. I'm hoping this one has the yellow sticker. Yeah, okay, so definite difference. 20 minutes I think is good. I would probably dial it back a bit, 15 minutes at 75 degrees, or you might want to reduce the temperature and extend it a bit longer. I haven't really noticed a huge difference between sort of 55 and 75. Obviously, the warmer it is, the shorter you should be doing it, but I prefer to sort of go sort of in the 70s and just, you know, not waste my time and roast for too long. I didn't really notice a major difference between sort of 55 and a lot longer versus 75 and shorter. So, clear difference there. Very, very clear difference now that it's cooled down. It's very important to let your tea cool down and taste it. Now I can really, really note the difference, and that's not just because I know which one is which. Okay, so again, right, so this is the yellow, and that's yellow. So we've got our Imperial Green here, and we're going to do the same thing. So this is 2017, just double check, don't make a mistake. You can see the color here is exactly the same. So again, not changing the color through the roast. Very, very important. Let's put that aside. And we are going to have to, I'm sure a lot of you out there think that I'm sort of mentally remembering which one is which. It's like one of those hustles on a street corner. SUPERLISTICIOUS. Probably got that wrong, but I certainly don't know which one is which here. Okay. I don't know why I thought of that method. That's the first time I've done that. It's probably because my little daughter's been watching Mary Poppins. Okay, let's cool this down a little bit. 88, it'll be enough. It'll be enough. I'll pour it in here first, just to cool it down a little bit more. Okay, let's rinse. I don't want to look at the bottom of this guy one. Okay. Okay, let's have a sniff. Oh, it smells great. As I said, I haven't tasted this 2017 Pure Green. I'm hoping that it still has some storage taste. I don't pick up anything there. Nutty, broad beans, sweet candy floss. Oh, lovely. Same. Exactly the same. Don't notice any difference there. Okay, this might not work out as well as I had hoped, but let's see. Well, it didn't need a roast, maybe. That's fine. Should have tested it before. I just sort of picked one out and threw it in the roaster just because I wanted to show all of you that you can also use this technique, which is, as I said, often used for oolongs, which are in storage, for other tea types. The Jinjin Mei that I ruined, I remember I did it for 2 hours at like 60 degrees, and the aromatics just, the stale taste or that sort of stale note did go, but then all of the aromatics went as well. It was a big moment at our place. It was not fun because I did quite a large amount. That's why I've learned from my experience, caution. Okay. Again, we're hoping that we don't see any big color difference between these two. No, I was going to say this might be a bit darker, but I think there's a little bit more water here, which is sort of giving the illusion that it's darker. Maybe that one's a bit darker. And maybe if I did roast it, it's a bit, I went a bit, it was 75 degrees. Anyway, let's taste. Taste is all that matters. It's nice. It's very nice. I mean, I do pick up a little bit of that Sakura Blossom sweet cardboardy note in it, I have to say. Should let it cool again a bit. And the texture in my mouth is, no, it's transforming, but it did hang about on the center of my tongue. It's still a bit dry. Anyway, let's compare it. Let's see if this is a lot more like that. It's too hot. Gotta let things cool down. That's quite a big difference, actually. Breathing out through my nose. This one tastes fresher, tastes more vibrant, lighter, brighter. This one, they both taste really good, but this one tastes a bit deeper and a little bit more of that. Yeah, again, as it cools down, a little bit more of that cardboardy note. Whereas this is, I'm picking up more of the natural broad bean nuttiness of this tea, and it just tastes cleaner. Again, just like that one, this one tastes cleaner. This one tastes a little bit like there's some additional things going on there. I'm getting a tiny bit of sourness on the back of my tongue. They are more different compared with the Tie Guanyin. I am still going for this side as roasted. Yeah. I'm going for that side roasted. Okay, so yeah, improved. Definitely improved, cleaner. And that's the thing here. This is about refreshing, cleaning, restoring, rather than changing, deepening, or adding browning or caramelization. So there you go. The refresher roast, sometimes people call it a re-roast or re-roasting your oolongs, but I think it's very important that you distinguish between those hotter roasts, which are bringing about changes in flavor, because you can still do those roasts, you know, a few years after a tea has been made. You can still do those roasts. It's less often, but you can. So very important that you distinguish it. This is a refresher roast. This is a restorative roast. This is about cleaning away any sort of mustiness or staleness in the tea, driving away those sort of sour notes and the dry texture. It's a very useful method if you have teas in your cupboard which you really, really love, but you've held on to them because you really love them and they're just not performing as well as they used to. Be cautious, make sure that you tread carefully, but I highly recommend you dive in and start to save your stale teas. That's it, tea heads. Check out our other videos. Taste our teas wherever you are in the world by browsing mayleaf.com, and come visit us if you're ever in London. Other than that, I'm Don from Mayleaf. Thank you for being a part of the revelation of true tea. Stay away from those tea bags. Keep drinking the good stuff and spread the word, because nobody deserves bad tea. Bye.